recording now and stop sharing the slide, and then Helen can get it started.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. Thank you, Matthew, for organising this. We know you as a former student, a former colleague, and now a member of the alumni of the CIMR. And thank you for inviting Abigail and Juliet to speak on this event. It's really nice to have this mix of people that we know, and with Ulrich, who's been a good colleague of ours, and he's a visiting fellow at the CIMR. So we've got a really nice mix of people, and we've got a really good audience that's a turn of our colleagues and students and former students. So it's great. So, and this is a very important topic. I think when we're looking at regional development, the skills agenda has to be one of the top two issues that are addressed by policymakers. Absolutely fundamental to understanding economic development, particularly regional economic development. So, and it's great that we've got an entrepreneur practitioner here as well to give a different perspective on things. So I'm going to hand it over to Matthew, who's going to take us through the next hour. So thank you, Matthew, for organising it.
No, thanks ever so much, and yep, delighted to be back at Birkbeck, albeit virtually this afternoon. So thanks ever so much for having me. And we'll move quite quickly into presentation from Abigail, and then that will be followed by the thoughts of Juliet Eccleston, who you'll have hopefully seen both their bios on the event listing when you came on to register, and that will be followed by Ulrich giving some discussion points for us to consider. And so then we'll open up to the floor for a good, hopefully 25 minutes or so of debate and questions for the panel, which hopefully will be very lively and interesting this lunchtime. So without further ado, if I hand over to Dr. Abigail Taylor to talk us through how we rise to the UK's skills challenges, please.
Thank you very much. I will just try to find to share the slides. Can you see that okay?
Yep.
Great. Well, thank you very much to Matt and to Helen for this really kind invitation. I'm delighted to be with you today, and also to everyone who's watching and listening. Thank you for attending, particularly on this extremely sunny day. I hope it's as nice where you are as it is here in Birmingham. This slide gives an overview of what I'm hoping to cover in my short presentation today. I'll explain where the material that I'm presenting comes from, the reports that it's based on, before summarising the skills context and some of the challenges we face here in the UK, before moving on to discuss the key findings from our report and the conclusions. The report was published about a year ago now, though, so obviously there's been a lot of change both in terms of context and also in relation to policy. So I will then try and draw out the key messages which I think the report offers for economic recovery in the context of the pandemic. So you can see on this screen 3 reports, and the material I'll be presenting here relates to a secondment which I conducted at the Industrial Strategy Council between 2019 and 2020. I worked on various projects there, but the conclusions I'd like to share with you relate to the Industrial Strategy Council's Skills Insight project. And that project focuses on skills in relation to productivity. It was focused on how economic growth in the UK is being constrained by the UK's weak skills base relative to comparative countries, and how this is projected to fall further in international league tables. So the research that we did involved several different stages, which I've listed there. An evidence review, analysis of employer and employee survey evidence, and then semi-structured interviews with employers, as well as case studies of international skills systems. And the report that's in orange is the overarching report, which draws together all of this analysis. Then the report in the top right is the report in which we I would say these two reports on the right are more background papers which go into greater detail on specific aspects of the UK skills system challenges and on international skills systems. And then the report in orange tries to bring the findings together to create this overarching vision, which we are trying to, or which we called for in the report. So in the Workplace Perspectives report, we analysed existing survey evidence relating to national employer and employee surveys, looking at specific skills and skills investment challenges that employers face as the nature of work is changing. We investigated how the current skills system in the UK supports and hampers employer decisions to invest in training. In addition to the analysis of existing survey evidence, we conducted interviews with employers in order to gain greater insight into their timeframes for addressing skills needs and the types of skills providers they use, their skills development and progression strategies at organisational level, and how they considered the skills system could best be improved. And then the International Case Studies report presented 5 country case studies, Canada, France, Japan, the Netherlands and Sweden, and we looked at the key features and challenges of the different skills systems to try and identify learning relevant to the UK. Moving on then to the context. The Industrial Strategy Council's actually, if we go back one stage, I'm sure many of you are aware that digitalisation is projected to create considerable change in work organisation and work processes. And in the context of technological change, individuals' attributes and skills are increasingly important in how employability is conceived. That's an area that's been explored by one of my colleagues, Anne Green, quite extensively. But the Industrial Strategy Council's first paper on skills emphasised the scale of skills challenges, particularly around upskilling and reskilling workers in the UK. And you can see here on the screen quite a striking graphic. The report found that by 2030, around 7 million additional workers in the UK could be underskilled for their job. This represents about 20% of the current workforce, and given 80% of the 2030 workforce is already working, severe skill shortages are likely, particularly around basic digital skills and management skills, unless action is taken. Another worrying trend is that participation in adult learning has continued to decrease over the last 2 decades. In 2019, participation was the lowest in the 23-year history of the adult participation in learning survey. And the other aspect of the situation that we analyse in the report is how the UK also stands out internationally due to the preference of employers to recruit rather than train. You can see the UK here on the right-hand side. It has the 4th highest percentage of employers in that category. So moving on to what we found in the report, the first chapter of the report analyzes why employer investment is in training is low relative to in many international competitor countries, and we identified 3 reasons for that: uncertainty over securing a return, poor access to suitable training, and a lack of flexibility in provision. Then when we conducted the employer interviews, we found that employers, particularly smaller firms, are struggling to prepare for the future and at the same time maintain the skills that they need to deal with business as usual at present. So really there seemed to be a lack of capacity to consider future business development skills needs. We also identified that we argue that there's a need for better quality targeting for smarter skills development rather than just increasing the volume of skills development per se. We need to think about which skills are particularly needed and how the UK can get there. And a very strong finding from the qualitative interviews was that the constant policy change over recent years has been confusing for employers, particularly for SMEs, and they called for, whilst they acknowledged that there are challenges with the existing policy, they suggested it should be refined rather than revolutionised, rather than starting with yet another policy again. In terms of our conclusions, the principal call in the paper is for a clear overarching vision for UK skills policy. There was a great quote from one of the interviews we did at one of the businesses that said that we need to know what we stand for, what we want to be good at, and hence which skills and capabilities we need to achieve that. I think it's important that this overarching vision is delivered through a long-term commitment to delivering in partnership. And also we argue that improving UK management practices and enabling individuals to assume responsibility for developing their own skills and learning is essential. The quality of managers and the broader institutional culture is central to shaping the opportunities made available to and the incentives for employees to participate in skills development and to utilise their skills in the workplace. What we found is that this appears to be recognised by employers, but investment in managerial training by firms continues to vary. Also, if you look at the survey evidence, managers are among the occupational groups with the greatest need for training, but they actually receive relatively little training. Among employers that trained in 2017, for example, only 35% provided management training compared to 84% that provided job-specific training. Also, we argued that changes in the structure of employment and in working lives mean that there's an increased onus on individuals to develop and adapt their skills. So a sort of clear element of the overarching vision should be enabling individuals to assume ongoing responsibility for developing their own skills, but we suggest that managers are crucial to this. I'm sure everyone's very aware of how a lot of things have changed over the past year. Clearly COVID has had an enormous impact on how and where employers and individuals work and learn. We suggest that, it's clear that COVID-19 is accentuating many of the trends highlighted in the paper, and if you look at the adult participation in learning survey, the latest year of that, you can see there's been a clear growth in digital learning. But also, if we look back to so therefore, I think you could argue that the current situation offers opportunities to develop some of the aspects we were calling for in the report. For example, increasing digital learning opportunities and ways of sharing learning. But also, there are likely to be challenges. If you look back to the 2008-2009 recession, analysis of training activity in the UK revealed how the recession prompted large numbers of employers to find innovative ways of maintaining training coverage whilst simultaneously reducing costs. To what extent will that be possible again, or will training just be reduced further? Also, there's been clear or considerable policy change. I've listed a couple of those policies at the bottom there. I don't have time to go into what each of those policies really involve, but I think it's fair to say that skills is a very important aspect of government policy, and I would suggest that the reforms that have been introduced recently are a very welcome step in the right direction, but that more is needed. Wider messages from the report, which I think are important as we start to recover from the pandemic, are the importance of policy stability and continuity. This emerged from the research as very important in terms of the ability of employers to navigate the skills system and to establish effective partnerships with other actors. The international, I mentioned that we did some international skills system profiles as part of the research, and all of the international systems that we profiled differed from the UK in terms of having less flux in their skills system. And I think that was important in why those skills systems were more successful, or at least was one of the reasons. There were others which we go into in the report as well. The second message, which I think is important, is improving how we use information and data analysis. Better data on training and outcomes and improved management practices can inform better training decisions. I think it's really important that if managers are to be making these decisions about which skills they support their employees to develop, they have access to up-to-date data to support these decisions. Also, we argue in the report that access to reliable local labour market and skills data can help sectoral and local partnerships to understand and address specific skills challenges. And then the final point there relates to our call in the report for the development of a broader positive lifelong learning culture in the UK. And in the report we provide examples of information campaigns, employing learning representatives, and flexible funding, which have all been used elsewhere to, or have been identified as important in communicating the benefits and necessity of lifelong learning to employees. I will stop there. There are some references there if anyone wants to follow up on any of the reports that I mentioned in my talk. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Abigail. Very thorough presentation there. I'm very appreciated that it was a short presentation, but I'm sure we'll be able to dive into the detail a little bit more through the questions that come through later. And obviously people can start putting those questions in the chat now so that we can start to come to those in due course. So if I hand over now to Juliet Eccleston, who's going to be sharing from her expertise around the sharing economy and recruitment.
Yes, thanks very much, and I'm very much in support of the work that has gone on before, and really just sharing my lens. And today I'm wearing two hats, if you like. One of being a founder and CEO of a recruitment platform, which is a platform where professionals recommend other professionals for roles. And also as the chair of Sharing Economy UK, where we have some unique insights just from an emerging economy that is very much growing. And really that's, I have sort of really four key and short comments to make. The first one is really around the sharing economy, and that in looking for solutions, we really need to be focusing on the new trends that are also happening currently. And Abigail touched on obviously the most recent news that's been happening over the last year, but also in the background, what we've been seeing is a significant growth of sharing economy platforms. And 70% of 18 to 34-year-olds have actually used sharing economy platforms. And as 16 to 25-year-olds are the most commonly impacted by lack of jobs right now, we can utilize that knowledge to recognize that sharing economy platforms can be used to help with that sharing of skills, that sharing of education and experience, and even to help build micro-entrepreneurs through that particular route. From a sharing economy perspective, we recognise that often people think of things like Airbnb and Uber and those kinds of platforms, but actually they're platforms where you can share your space, skills and stuff, as we say within the trade body. And so it does open up a really broad opportunity for people to utilise that more, as it's already a growing trend. And being platforms, they do end up resulting in the ability to scale globally, which is something that I think should be leveraged more. The second point I really wanted to make was also touched on, which is collaboration. From an Any Good perspective, which is my platform, we see collaboration both at a micro level in terms of candidates and participants, where professionals are recommending people for roles. And what that means is that they have an ally and an amplifier that are helping them get the specific job that is right for them. And so we see it right at the end of the process, but also right at the beginning, where we need the regulations and the policy and the programs to help provide those jobs in the first place and provide those additional skills and training. And so that's something that we want to really see at all levels throughout the end-to-end process. And also collaborating across organisations. We saw this very much in pockets over the last year, where I was working with the CBI on the redeployment of people challenge. And what we saw there was very much the ability for organisations to work very closely together that had never worked that closely before. For example, we saw Uber drivers being utilised as delivery drivers for shopping and things like that. And suddenly an organisation such as the CBI can help all of those organisations connect and work effectively together and begin to transition people where they have the skills from one role that is perhaps in decline towards something that's growing. And it's almost as if we need to bottle those processes and that immediate ability that became apparent, and now start to move from that position rather than pre-COVID, where we were working much more separately. So we're very much hoping that that collaboration can continue. Thirdly, what I was wanting to mention was that the employers are very much the enablers of the change. And so in doing anything regarding new regulations or policy or programs, really the employers, and especially the SMEs that were mentioned in the report, need to be considered in terms of what it is that they need to help deliver the change and deliver it to make a difference from a productivity perspective. We're seeing some significant cultural challenges with employers recognizing that they can take on people from different industries into their organisation and help to redeploy those people. And so there's definitely some cultural change regarding people transitioning. Some of that is some historical challenges around the recruitment industry, where you have specific recruitment agents focusing on specific niches, so they only draw from one candidate pool. What we'd rather see is broader candidate pools where people are considered for their potential rather than for purely what's on their CV or in their background or what they've been trained in. And a final note, and if anybody ever hears me anywhere, it's normally my final note on any kind of design. What I would be calling for is for the extremes of society to be considered in designing any kind of new process. What we've found is that in designing for extremes, those that have the most barriers and that are the most challenged, we find that we have a better process end to end. And often those people that are at the extremes can be forgotten when we think about the population as a bell curve or as a graph. But really, when in terms of the end process and the end impact on people and the participants of schemes and those that are actually impacted at the sharp end, if these programs and policies and regulation can focus on those first, then it serves everybody well. And those are the 4 points that I wanted to make. And I know that we don't have too much time, so I was really wanting to hand over to the next speaker so that we can continue and get some discussion going.
Absolutely, thanks ever so much. That was great. And indeed, if we hand over now to Professor Ulrich Hilpert, Chair of Comparative Government. Ulrich, if you're there, and perhaps you'd like to discuss what you've heard so far and set some themes for discussion as we ahead of the broader debate and chat that we'll have.
Yes, hi, thank you. Well, it is very interesting, and I'm far away from saying how you should do this in Britain. Well, I lived in a couple of different countries in Europe and in the US, so and I did notice the differences in skills and education. Yeah, and I think there's one thing that is very important, that is something societies need to share. They need to value training very high. That is not everywhere the case. For instance, at least when I remember myself to the United States, there they think that education and training is something that is in the individual's interest, not in the society's interest, first of all. So that an individual who gains better skills and better education has a personal profit from that. So that should not necessarily be something that an enterprise is dealing with. And that is a difference when I consider this with regard to countries like Switzerland, Austria, Germany, and the northern countries, the Scandinavian countries. There, of course, is a long-lasting system of training, what usually takes very long. And I think that's important. In Germany, for instance, and these countries as well, the training is usually 3 to 3.5 years. And that is when the Americans, for instance, talk about apprenticeships and talk about 6 months, usually in these countries, we do not really know what they mean, because that would be, let's say, the beginning of the training in these countries. It is important to keep this in mind, because this means that societies face the question of training and skills very differently, and when they face it differently, of course, they make it differently available. Maybe one further example, what is important is when in Germany, for instance, I can only speak for Germany because I know this from there, that might be in some of these countries similar. When the enterprises and the unions are bargaining every year about income and working conditions and so on, they include the bargaining on times for continuing education. So there is usually within these bargains and the contracts that the unions and the enterprises have, 1 or 2 weeks of training a year included, which means 2 things. The one thing is that the employees are more up to date and you can use this opportunity. And on the other hand, the enterprises have up to date employees with which might be ready for innovation. Not everybody individually, of course, yeah. But that as a general comment, because just to see that the context of these things is very different. There was one slide that Abigail was presenting, which was particularly interesting regarding training and recruitment. If Abigail can put that on, that would be interesting. And that was how the share of enterprises which are recruiting instead of training. And that is in Germany shown very high as well. But you need to know that the big enterprises are usually educating or training many more people than they will hire in the end. That is for the one reason they say, in the end, we can, when you look there, over there, Germany is, let me see, where were we there? Well, 55% or so are recruiting instead of training, what is pretty high when we look at this. And this means that, as I said, the big enterprises are training many more people in their apprenticeships than they do hire in the end. The reason is that they can pick, of course, the best ones. And at the same time, of course, they supply well-trained personnel, young personnel, to smaller enterprises. sometimes the enterprises are too small to qualify for training. Because not every enterprise or small enterprise is allowed to or is accepted and qualified to training. When you see that, does not mean that the training level is very low. It simply means that the difference between those which are training and those who are not training is widely covered by other, in particular by the large enterprises. Yeah. So when there are small enterprises close to a place where Daimler-Benz or Siemens or some chemical firms or so are training, they are usually very happy because they can recruit from those whom the enterprises do not call themselves. Then there's something else what is important when you can take into consideration that an apprenticeship takes about 3 to 3.5 years, sometimes even 4. Then of course they learn a lot, and during this time they very often go to also to school for 1 or 2 days a week. So they do not only learn practical things, they also start to understand how things work and how they are educated. That was some time ago, I think it was in the 70s and 80s, there was a dispute between the unions and the enterprises because the enterprises wanted to reduce the time of training, saying that is, of course, they learn more than they need in their enterprises, and the unions wanted to have that that it's extended or continued as it is, because they said then people can also change their jobs. In the meanwhile, there is no dispute about it anymore, because what the enterprises learned is the more general the skills are, the better they are prepared for innovation on the job. So if new machines are coming, it's easier for them to understand it if they are better skilled, if the organization changes, and so on. So that is an important point, and that is done. Finally, also worth to know for the system is the quality of the skills at the end is not examined in the enterprise, it is examined in a formal board, which is formed by the enterprises, by public authorities, and sometimes also by members of the unions. So that the skills have a very wide range, which is usually much more than you need in a particular enterprise, but which allows an enterprise also to change to other jobs, similar, as mentioned before, on the basis with regard to the Uber trainer. So this is a different level then. What did I mention over here? And then, of course, when there was a time that only the STEM research phase, so or the mathematics, engineering, and natural sciences and so on were regarded to be high, and that university training was important. It is now clear more and more that we need very well trained personnel on the level of manufacturing, because if there are only ideas but nobody can do the product, you have a problem. So it links. So you see, it links up with this. There are a couple of initiatives which try to balance this, and also, of course, the system is very open, so that people very often can. Oh, there was something. That people very often can upgrade their skills. Let's say from a training to a university trained engineer, educated engineer. But the general idea is to upgrade all the time the skills and to be ready for the next generation innovation. So what you see, it is very much innovation based. There is also, of course, an area which is, let's say, using new opportunities, just like in digitalization, where I think Germany is not necessarily the best country, but in digitalization or in services. But even there is, let's say, a long-lasting training, usually also 3 years. So when you have, let's say, so if you go to a department store or so and talk to people, they usually have a training on that. But that is a different thing when we talk about industrial enterprises, manufacturing. That is particularly high graded. So what it means is there are different sectors, and what you learn is very different in banking, for instance, or in department stores, or chemical industries, mechanical engineering, and so on. But it is always based on a level of skills, which also help the people very often to change their jobs, because there is a constant change of jobs through their work life, or a change on their jobs during their work life. Yeah. At the same time, it helps them also to stay in the enterprises when there are new organizations or new equipment introduced. So I hope I stayed in time.
Great, absolutely. We have a great amount of time for questions and comments and discussion. There's already a couple that have come through, but now would be a fantastic opportunity for those that have joined us in this conversation to start to have a think about any questions they might want to ask. So as they come through, perhaps if I come to Abigail and Juliet, could you give us examples of good practice in training, current and past? So Abigail, would you like to start us off on that? Do you have a practical example you could share?
Yeah, I think one of the examples that struck me when we were doing the qualitative interviews with firms was that one of the firms we interviewed was it was a family firm that had grown quite rapidly, and they had instigated new systems to support the training of employees because they felt that it was very ad hoc before. It sort of depended on the experiences of the managers. It wasn't particularly coming at something that was encouraged from the top of the company down. And it wasn't being experienced equally across the firm. And that wasn't necessarily the fault of the managers who were who were responsible for the training. It was just that the culture of the organization meant that prior to these reforms being introduced, the company focused very much on everyday delivery of the products they were making, and they didn't necessarily, even when managers wanted to release employees for training, that they felt that they couldn't because there was perhaps a potential that would lead to the day's targets not being met. So what that company did, and it hasn't been easy, is that from the top down, they stressed the importance of training. They recruited a specific director of training to be responsible for developing a new system in which this training was available online, but also resources were developed for managers to talk about training needs with their employees and to develop opportunities for and bespoke training packages for employees within the company. I think that's the example I would give them.
Great. And Juliet, how about you? Do you have an example?
Yeah, there's probably a couple of things I've seen both prior to and throughout the last year. So I've been engaged with an organisation that where it is also focused on. We very much focus on the potential of people rather than just CVs, and I think that's critical for where we are in terms of looking at what people's potential is. But understanding that is an incredibly difficult thing to do, and to put that over to an employer and an organisation that we were working with, rather than them spending their money specifically on recruitment agencies, we're spending it on a more of a training concept where people, similarly to perhaps the model in Germany, where people were being trained in order to then have an interview, if you like. And so candidates were being identified that weren't quite at the level that was needed for a role. Then they would go through sort of a digital or a technology boot camp, and then they would have the interview. And so the recruitment fees were spent on training rather than on traditional recruitment, and then the organisation would pick from those people that had gone through the boot camp to hire them into their organisation. The candidates, meanwhile, had all had the training and potentially would be able to go on to follow on roles as well. And I thought that was an interesting model to look at. The other thing I've seen over the last year is just with the advent of remote onboarding, is also the advent of sort of remote coaching and mentoring, and I think as people have needed to be hired into organisations where I mean, ultimately, everybody needs some level of training and coaching as they arrive into an organisation. We've seen much more of that continue on in a different way. There's much more of a recognition that you might need somebody in a sort of in a constant chat facility, and that's something that I've really liked, is that rather than sitting next to somebody and being able to ask questions, you don't have that when you're sat at home. And so people are recognizing that they need somebody just to be able to type a quick question to, or to ask a question of, or to just speak as you want to. And often microphones are just left open for the day, as you would do in work. But the organizations have really sort of started to transition to that model, and I think some of those things will remain with us, hopefully.
Yeah, that's a really great point, well, both great points actually. On the first point, perhaps if we've had a question come through from Jonathan. I don't know, Jonathan, if you want to kind of unmute yourself and just quickly, succinctly introduce yourself and ask your question direct. It feels like a question that perhaps Ulrich could kick us off on. So I don't know if, Jonathan, you're there.
I'm back. Oh, I was lost because I was just putting something aside. Yeah. No, what I noticed, of course, from this talking also, it is a different system with regard to training. Yeah, and this is not only in Britain, in France, Spain, and southern Italy. It's similar. So the question is whether you go in depth with regard to particular skills that you need in an enterprise, or whether you're thinking about a general system and a pool of information that is available within a society that could be used for the enterprises. Yeah, and that, of course, makes a difference. And the system, when talking about this and looking at it, and I think the countries which I mentioned before, which have a similar system as we have, of course, there's a long tradition. You cannot change it from today into this system. So you need to find out what suits best. In so far, what I would be careful is to pinpoint it only to the individual needs of a particular enterprise, because then you again have it very specialized, and you get the problem that someone changing the enterprises and changing the products they make, of course, would have a problem to get into it. Yeah. Nevertheless, the skill question, I think, is very important to mention, not as against the academic education or university education, but to complement it and to link with it. And so far also, I think the idea, I personally think so, the idea of having people to pass through a long apprenticeship, then have some experience in jobs, and then go to the university, have university and engineering or something similar as a training is not bad, because these people are not only, these people have seen enterprises from inside, instead of just learning about how an enterprise may look like. And at the end of the university training, they go there and are surprised how they look in practice. Yeah. So an open system, I think, is very important, because there are many skills which are not codified, but which are very important to understand, to use it, to know how it's organized, to know how to deal it, and so on. Maybe one example, there are metal workers who can put their hands on the metal and they tell you what kind of metal it is. This is nothing you learn. This is very often, it's the second or third generation. Yeah? And there are other things like this, and this, I think, this simply needs to be valued. Yeah.
Great. Great, thanks. And I think, I'm not sure if Jonathan was able to kind of ask his question directly, so I'll perhaps just ask it on his behalf from the...
Oh, yes, hello, yes.
On the German experience. Oh, hi,
yeah, hello, yeah, Jonathan here. Lovely seminar, thanks very much for it. There was this very interesting idea that Ulrich put, that large firms can train more people than they actually need. And Ulrich said, you know, they may do this in order to select the best people. Yes. But my point was that seems very expensive to pay the training for large numbers of people just to select the best. So I did wonder, and also the transferability of that. I wondered, to transfer to the UK, whether the public sector could successfully subsidize large firms to train. I mean, because clearly they're you know, to overtrain. Clearly they're not really doing it now, I guess.
Maybe I should answer that. The point is, indeed, the large firms do so, and of course they also have the calculations. They know that they need the best trained people to produce the products they are selling, and insofar it is expensive, but it's a bargain for them in the end, because this way they can train them. They know what they can, and they also, that not to forget, they provide their suppliers with good personnel. So they may not immediately benefit from it, but in a certain way they all benefit from it. But it demands, of course, an attitude towards skills and towards an idea that sharing skills is something everybody or every enterprise benefits from. The costs are very high. I have not the current the current dates, how much it is, but the cost of a training in Germany is, or was, and I think it still is, more than twice as expensive than university education. That is very often forgotten, but this is what they do. Yeah, that were the calculations. Yeah.
I think just sorry, did you want to finish, or?
No, only one word. The point is how to motivate enterprises to do these things. You just mentioned, Jonathan, to subsidize this through the government. That would be an opportunity, probably in the system as it is. And but sometimes they should learn that it is in their own benefit instead of always getting money for that.
I was going to say, from my experience of UK recruitment, it is so expensive for the large firms in terms of how much they do put into the recruitment industry, that actually looking at how much it does cost for training, it can be comparable when we've looked at the difference. And often what they will do when they hire somebody that's been through their training is that's also reflected in the salary that's then given. So somebody that's been through, that's sort of been identified as somebody that maybe has 60% of the skills needed, and then they've been trained up to 80%, would be on a lower salary than somebody that was recruited because they had 100% of the skills. And so they start to make the employers, if they're kind of considering it in that way, would recognise that they do actually get their money back, and if not more, from switching from recruitment through to training, or probably a hybrid of both, I would say, just to make sure that they are still competing from those people that they're bringing in perspective.
Thanks,
maybe
everyone.
Maybe one word again. If you talk about these things in Germany, for instance, I think it's interesting that the unions and the enterprise organizations, they always include with their bargaining every year the question of continuing education and skills. And that is simply that the enterprises learned they need it. They do not like the costs, of course. There's no surprise. Yeah, but they know that they need these skills. And they pay the price with regard to the wages, of course. Yeah.
Great, and I'm just going to kind of flag that we've got almost exactly 10 minutes left of this discussion. We've got a nice, easy topic that is AI and automation, which I'm sure we can do justice to in 5 minutes or so. Obviously, it would be remiss of me as well, coming from Chartered Management Institute, not to perhaps focus in a little bit more on the management and leadership skills identified in the reporter's core requirement. So there's a good couple of topics there to kind of close us out, but obviously if anybody is with us that has a further question, please do use the function as soon as possible, and we'll try and squeeze another question from the audience as well. So we have a question that's come through from Skills for Thought. Again, if I just kind of open it up to see if you want to open up your microphone and quickly ask the question succinctly.
Hi there, thank you. I'm a student at the moment, and it seems to me that during my lifetime, skills and the focus on skills in this country has never really expanded, and I'd like to sort of know whether AI is making it the way that this will continue as a trend, or whether the report authors think that this is going to change, and why. That's a little bit more succinct, hopefully. Thank you.
That's great. I think I caught most of that. Hopefully the panel did as well. Perhaps, Abigail, should we come to you first on that question? If Abigail's still with us, if not, Juliet, perhaps would you like to kick us off?
Yes, certainly. I mean, I think in terms of AI, and this is really from what I've seen, and I'm sure there are people that have done studies on it that regarding the actual impact of AI on jobs. I do see an awful lot of comment around jobs going because of the introduction of AI, but on the ground right now, what I see more of is and maybe this is just in my industry of recruitment, but more of an overstatement of what it's capable of currently. I think in terms of where it's going to, maybe in sort of 10, 20 years time, then maybe we're looking at more of an impact. But right now, and probably I would say certainly for the next 5 years, the actual impact on jobs that we're seeing isn't as much as what often is reported in the press in terms of headlines. We're certainly seeing within the recruitment industry itself claims of AI helping identify the right candidates for jobs and those kinds of things, but in the reality, actually, I think there's a lot of people behind the scenes that are also supporting technology, and so at the moment, I believe there's more of a focus in our industry on the combination of human and technology, rather than it being a pure technology driven approach.
Yeah, I would agree with that as well. I think the research that we conducted as part of the report suggested that employers value employees who have a wide range of skills, because we're not sure exactly which skills are going to be needed with technology changing so rapidly. There was actually often a greater focus on softer skills or broader skills that employees could develop in future. I think a lot of the employers talked about engaging people who had the right attitude, the right hunger on the grounds, that then they would be able to adapt and learn once things are a bit clearer in future.
Great, thanks. Well, so we've had a question come through from Klaus as well, which I'll just very quickly read out because of the time remaining in this discussion. So the skills issue was once 10 to 15 years ago seen in the context of flexicurity. Why has this discourse disappeared? Now, that's an interesting question. Is that one perhaps for Ulrich? Is that something that you've come across before, the term flexicurity, and why do we think it might have disappeared?
No, flexicurity I've heard so far, and I cannot tell you why certain topics are disappearing. No, I don't see the time. I can't answer the question.
Great, that's helpful to know. And so would anyone like to address this question? Abigail, have you come across flexicurity before? No. Juliet?
No, if there's any clarity on the question, that would be helpful.
Sure.
Sorry.
After you. Okay, I think we've got just 5 minutes left. So obviously, perhaps that's one that we can pick up offline by email afterwards. That would be really interesting. So we're going to wrap up in the last couple of minutes. So what might be very helpful, we've obviously had some good questions there from the audience. We've obviously only been able to scratch the surface of the skills debate on this particular occasion, but obviously there's been lots of food for thought there. So perhaps if we go around the panel, and if you'd like to offer your kind of closing thoughts on what you've heard today, and perhaps give a key takeaway message based on the information that you've presented and heard today. So why don't we kick off with our presenter, Abigail?
Thank you. I think the thing that I found really interesting is hearing more about the German system, and I think it underlines to me the importance of developing skills pathways to enable people to better progress between the vocational education system, higher education, and employment and training once people are in work. I think it's really important that the skills white paper is built on to enable people to build up and progress along these pathways. And one thing that I'm particularly keen on is that there are opportunities for bite-sized learning that are accredited, so people can build upon what they develop through these pathways.
That's great to hear, and certainly CMI has just released a whole suite of bite-sized programs, so that's a great news from our perspective. And Juliet, over to you. How about you? How would you sum up?
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely these sessions are incredibly useful because you hear about insights from all sorts of places, and I think for the government really to sort of take that ownership of the vision and to take their time in looking at what's happening in other countries and use the academic research papers and use the experts, but also those organisations on the ground, and so begin to really pull all of the people together that are experienced in this and also seeing it elsewhere. And begin to collaborate and set that collaboration right up from the beginning, so it's less of a competitive sort of type approach and more of a collaborative one between partners.
Yeah, absolutely, and obviously, Ulrich, that's something we've heard from you throughout this conversation as well, around the approach to bargaining and collaboration in Germany. So perhaps if I can leave you to sum up in the last minute or so on what you've heard today and closing thought.
Yeah, instead of summarizing what was said, I think it was important what you mentioned, the artificial intelligence point and the automation, yeah, because that will be, of course, a challenge and a question with regard to skills. Repetitive work will probably be replaced, even if it's cheap, because when you replace it by machines, it will be precise all the time, the same way. And at the same time, of course, it is the question what to do in future. And so there's a lot of discussion about the work of future and so on, but it will be related with skills, and the skills will be changing. And particularly, of course, skills dealing with the digital equipment and so on is very important, because I think there will be lots and lots of equipment to assist people during their work. And not replacing only, but upgrading it, changing it, sometimes downgrading as well. So that needs to be really looked at what it means, because the effects can be societally quite heavily, but there is the opportunity of steering it.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, that perhaps gives us a good jumping off point to kind of continue the conversation. I'm sure CIMR will be kind of interested in more sessions around skills. I don't think that there's enough time and day to cover off all the issues that we need to. So if it just leads me to thank the panel for your time and your insights. That's been fantastic. Thank you ever so much for everyone for joining us. And if I hand it back over to Director of the Centre, Helen.
My thanks too. Thank you very much, Matt, for organising it, for Abigail and Juliet, and for Ulrich for his comments, and thank you comments from the floor too. Very interesting discussion, and definitely we need to have another event on skills, and we'll put that in the calendar for the autumn term. And I'd also like to thank Isabel for all her hard work again, and Isabel is recording this, and she will very kindly do a blog that we will share with you later when she's had a chance to do it after the Easter break. But yeah, it's another great session, so thank you very much everybody for taking part, and I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.